Go ahead, Mehmet.
Thank you, Dina. Good evening. I'm Mehmet Ansoy, Vice President of Denver Astronomical Society. This evening, we are delighted to have Alex Herbert, one of our members, to give a talk about ISS at 24 years and beyond. Alex currently serves as the Space System Safety Engineer for General Atomics Electromagnetic Systems in Centennial, Colorado. Previously, he served as the Flight Safety Engineering Supervisor for Zinn Technologies, Inc., a prime contractor for NASA Glenn Research Center, GRC, in Cleveland, Ohio. In that role, he was involved in projects ranging from crew-operated scientific payloads for the ISS, International Space Station, propulsion and life support subsystems for the Gateway Station, the Space Launch System, SLS, Block 1B Super Heavy Lift Expandable Launch Vehicle, and NASA's Evolutionary Xenon Thruster, NEXT, for the recent Double Asteroid Redirection Test, DART. So, Alex, please start with your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mehmet. I was asked to put this presentation together a few months ago, speaking about the International Space Station, how this grand project came to be, a little bit about what we're currently doing on the station, and where we're hoping to go next as far as habitable outposts in the near-Earth environment. I'll give you a fair warning. I'm going to editorialize quite a bit during this presentation. My goal is not to sit here and read documentation to you. And the standard disclaimer applies. These are my thoughts, my understanding. I could be wrong. These aren't the official positions of NASA, Roscosmos, other scientists, engineers, US presidents, living or dead, so on and so forth. I'm actually going to jump back and forth quite a bit in the chronology as we go, but in general, I'm going to talk again about where this whole experiment got started, a little bit of what we're doing, and where we're going next. So I'd hazard a guess that most of us are familiar with President Kennedy's 1962 speech to Rice University when he challenged us to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Talking about the launch of what would eventually become the Apollo program. But fewer of us may know that Ronald Reagan followed suit in his 1984 State of the Union address. He announced, "Tonight, I am directing NASA to develop a permanently manned space station and do it within a decade." And he went on to explain that a space station will permit quantum leaps in our research in science, communications, in metals, and in life-saving medicines, which could be manufactured only in space. We want our friends to help us meet these challenges and share in their benefits. NASA will invite other countries to participate so we can strengthen peace, build prosperity, and expand freedom for all who share our goals. NASA leapt into action, forming a new space station program office at Johnson Space Center in Houston in 1985, and quickly signing agreements with the European Space Agency, or ESA, and Japan's National Space Development Agency, what is now known as the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency, or JAXA. In April of 1988, NASA Associate Administrator James Odom sent a memorandum soliciting names for a new space station with a list of general requirements. 16 proposals were considered by the Space Station Name Committee. 6 continued NASA's tradition of mythological references: Hercules, Minerva, Aurora, Jupiter, Pegasus, Olympia. 3 proposals, Earth Star, Starlight, and Landmark, correctly predicted that the station would become a new fixture in our night sky. There was also Skybase, which referenced the earlier Skylab station, and Pilgrim and Prospector, which referred to America's history of exploration and expansion. And 4 more would focus on traditional American ideals: independence, liberty, unity, and freedom, which was actually the final selection made by President Reagan the following July. The word freedom actually featured prominently in that first State of the Union address. So, yeah, we're not above sucking up to the boss a little bit. And in September, the United States, Japan, Canada, and 9 members of ESA signed the first intergovernmental agreement to begin construction. The Russians had already launched Mir in 1986, so we actually had quite a bit of catching up to do at this point. And then the world changed. So in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The EO-10 crew launched to Mir as Soviet citizens and returned 5 months later as citizens of the new Russian Federation. The new Russian Federal Space Agency, what would eventually become Roscosmos as we know today, was born already struggling for survival. The agency was desperate for funding, and there were significant concerns in the international community that its civilian scientists and engineers might just find gainful employment with less than reputable sources. It turns out there's not a whole lot of difference between building a launch vehicle and building an ICBM, and no one really wanted that to happen. So Presidents Boris Yeltsin and George H.W. Bush quickly signed an agreement for what would become the Shuttle Mir program to prop it up for the next few years. However, the planned Mir 2 station, which is kind of pictured here in concept art, was now financially out of reach for the Russian Space Agency. Meanwhile, Space Station Freedom was also having problems. It weathered 7 design changes over 9 years, each time losing capability, resulting in the greatly diminished 4-man Space Station Alpha program pictured here. And in June of 1993, an amendment to completely remove it from NASA's appropriations bill failed by only a single vote in the House. Kind of seeing the writing on the wall, NASA and Roscosmos met the following October, resulting in Roscosmos being invited to join the ISS program as its 5th partner after the United States, Japan, ESA, Canada. And in January of 1998, a new intergovernmental agreement was signed. And the following November, the Russian Power, Propulsion, and Cargo module Zarya was launched, which was originally supposed to be the core module for Mir 2, and it was quickly repurposed for this new joint venture. The US connecting module Unity Node 1 arrived with the Space Shuttle Endeavour 3 weeks later, and the Russian service and habitation module Zvezda was connected in July of 2000, and then ISS Expedition 1 officially began in October of that year. So from left to right, this is Soyuz Commander Yuri P. Gitzenko, Expedition 1 Commander William M. Shepard, or Shep, and Flight Engineer Sergei K. Kriklev. Now, the name Freedom was dropped from the space station program when it was expanded to include Russia, and it was briefly referred to as International Space Station Alpha, or ISS-A, for a couple of years before that too was quietly dropped. So when ISS was formally launched and crewed, it didn't actually have a name, and this didn't sit well with Shep. Shep held to an old nautical tradition that it was bad form, if not bad luck, to sail on a ship with no name. He pressed NASA on this before launch without any success. So once on orbit, he took matters into his own hands. He and Sergei kind of got together, had a conversation, and they agreed to resurrect the name Alpha. Alpha being neither Russian nor English, but Greek, which is a common root of both languages. And it also symbolizes something that's first, something that's primary, a new beginning for this new cooperative venture. Shep quickly put NASA on the spot with his request to name the station over the mic, and Administrator Dan Goldflin kind of grudgingly agreed that Alpha would be the call sign for the station for the duration of Expedition 1. It didn't last any longer than that, and to this day, the International Space Station doesn't technically have a name. Those in the program tend to think of it just as ISS or simply station. So Alpha is as close as it gets to having a formal name. And that may be the longest explanation for a title slide that you've ever sat through. And if I went through every single update and reconfiguration, we'd be here for another 24 years. So we're just going to speed this up a little bit. And I'm going to pause this at certain points along the way. Yeah, so in 2001, the Destiny module, or the US lab, or the US orbital segment, was launched. This is actually where most of the experiments that I worked on was conducted. This is the main, again, United States laboratory. The Russians have their own laboratory, as do the Europeans and the Japanese, which we're going to see added to the configuration coming up. Yeah, so at this point, I've graduated high school. I'm about to graduate college. So in 2007, comedian Stephen Colbert unsuccessfully petitioned NASA to name Harmony Node 2 in his honor. That obviously failed, but the program was so, I guess, popular, and NASA loves good press. Colbert did eventually get a treadmill named after him on the station. So it's a nice consolation prize. So Columbus, that's the European module. Kibo's the Japanese experiment module. And at this point, we're quickly going to run out of dates, because this video was actually published by NASA quite a few years ago. So ULF-6 was actually installed in May of 2011. And then, actually, we're going to go back a little bit here. The last module to be added was Nauka, or the Russian Multi-Purpose Laboratory Module, or MLM. We kind of just yada over 7 more components and 10 years of work, but we're actually going to come back to this a little bit later near the end of the presentation. So some additional configuration changes that have happened relatively recently. So the original solar panels are 24 years old, and they definitely have some city miles on them. So NASA designed 6 new ISS rollout solar arrays, or IROSs, which were launched in 2021. Each one needed 2 spacewalks to install. And I believe this installation for this configuration finally wrapped up last month. And some modules actually didn't make it off the drawing board. So the proposed Nautilus X centrifuge, which stands for non-atmospheric universal transport intended for lengthy United States exploration, no one actually calls by the full name, would have demonstrated technology for simulated spin gravity to improve crew health on long duration missions, such as manned missions to Mars. But again, that module never quite made it off the drawing board and never made it into production. So that brings us just about up to present day. So what are we actually doing on the station? I said we're going to jump around in chronology a little bit, so we're going to go back to Mir really quick. On the 24th of February, 1997, one of the electron oxygen generation units on Mir caught fire during routine replacement of a lithium perchlorate canister. The flame spanned the width of the module, cutting off access to the Soyuz capsule so the crew actually couldn't escape. The crew donned oxygen masks, but the limited space meant that only a single crew member could actually combat the fire. The commander emptied 3 fire extinguishers into the module, and fortunately the fire was stopped without injury or even significant damage to the station. But years later, NASA narrowed down the cause of this fire to a latex glove that had accidentally been sucked into the canister during the replacement. NASA has been understandably interested in fire prevention since then, especially since these same oxygen generation units are incorporated into the design of the ISS through the Russian segment. So I've been involved in a couple experiments by NASA to study fire in microgravity. Fire, of course, behaves very differently without gravity than it would down here on Earth. Let me get a laser pointer up here. So this is the combustion integrated rack, or CIR, which again is located in the Destiny laboratory module. It was installed in 2008, and it's hosted a succession of payloads: the multi-user droplet combustion apparatus, or MDCA, the advanced combustion via microgravity experiments, or ACME, and currently it's hosting the solid fuel ignition and extinction, or SOFI experiment. Respectively, they study combustion behavior of liquids, gases, and now solids. This is actually one of my favorite pictures. This is an example burn from the flame design experiment in ACME, showing that fire in microgravity is it's a terrifying prospect, but it's definitely something very beautiful. But even more ambitious was the spacecraft fire safety experiments, or SAFFIRE. This was a series of 5 demonstrations that involved purposely starting fires in the Cygnus resupply vehicles after disembarking the ISS for disposal. So it was a experiment package about the size of like a high school locker that was stowed in the vehicle pretty much throughout its life in the ISS. And then once the resupply vehicle was jettisoned, the flammable samples within the experiment were ignited, and the byproducts of that of those fires were then studied for new smoke detection technologies. So on the opposite end of the spectrum, NASA is also very interested in fluids and materials studies. NASA is also working with commercial partners to expand utilization of ISS facilities for privately funded research. So this is the droplet formation study that I worked on with Delta Faucet. We designed an apparatus for studying how shower heads behave in microgravity, studying how shower heads output water droplets without gravity interfering with the measurements. This was conducted in the Microgravity Science Glove Box, or MSG, which is another very large rack, the neighbor of CIR and its sister module, the FIR, still in the Destiny module. While you may see a lot of clips of astronauts playing with water, generally it's not a good thing to spray droplets all over the inside of the station. So we had to come up with this chamber design that provided enough containment to prevent the water spray from going everywhere, but still vented enough to avoid pressurizing anything in the process. And speaking of containment, this is actually my favorite experiment that I worked on, which is much more simple. This is called lyophilization in microgravity. Lyophilization is a very complicated word. It's a fancy word for freeze drying. So freeze drying is a technique used to remove water from drugs, food, and other materials to increase their shelf life. I actually worked in freeze drying in the pharmaceutical industry for about a decade before moving into spaceflight. So I was very excited to learn that my company was involved in studying the same technique on ISS. It wasn't very successful though. So on Earth, the technique involves drying a solution from ice directly into powder in open top vials. But without gravity to keep the powder in the vials on orbit, the apparatus ended up blowing powder all over the place, kind of turning the vacuum chamber and the whole glove box into a snow globe. I tried to fix this by mounting a permeable membrane on top of the vial. It lets water and water vapor through, but keeps powder inside the vial, and it worked kind of. And hopefully the next round of experiments will be quite a bit better. This was my favorite because no one else really understood the freeze drying process. It's an esoteric technique, even in the industry. So I got to be much more involved in this experiment than I normally would have. From redesigning the experiment, defending it to NASA, building the hardware, carrying it down to Cape Canaveral, watching the launch, and then sitting on console with the crew while they worked on it. It was far beyond anything I thought I'd get to experience through my work in this program. So this is maybe rather small and simple, but this is very near and dear to my heart. All right, so segueing from freeze drying into coffee. So how does one actually drink coffee in space? The original method was by adding warm water to freeze-dried coffee powder, so instant coffee powder, in a pouch and then sucking it through a straw. This wouldn't do for Italian astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti. Italian coffee maker Lavazza partnered with engineering firm Architect to develop the ISS Espresso, which was a microgravity espresso machine, pretty much specifically for her as the first Italian astronaut to fly to the International Space Station. Now, you can't drink espresso properly through a straw. So my company worked with Portland State University and another engineering firm named IRPI to develop a microgravity coffee cup. The weird contours of this cup keeps the liquid inside through surface tension and also draws the liquid up to the brim for the astronaut to drink. So this was relatively successful. And there was actually a follow-on experiment that modified this cup to work with a syringe-driven pour-over apparatus. There's a stupid amount of drama that happened with that. I don't even want to call it a follow-on experiment, but that's a little outside the scope of this presentation. I might come back to that at the very end if there are any questions on that. But yeah, that was a wild ride in and of itself. So again, where are we going from here? I'd mentioned that NASA is more and more partnering with commercial partners to expand utilization of ISS. NASA experiments tend to be very large, very complex, and thus very long in life cycle from development all the way through operation, which after a while left ISS facilities somewhat empty. And we want to give the taxpayer the biggest bang for their buck. So NASA is partnering with private companies to kind of backfill their utilization schedule with smaller, simpler payloads and science experiments. So in 2011, NASA entered into an agreement with the Center for the Advancement of Science in Space, or CASIS, to manage the ISS National Laboratory. And eventually CASIS kind of appropriated the ISS National Laboratory name for themselves, which I think caused a little bit of consternation, but that's, again, another story. Their significant focus has been in opening ISS to commercial ventures, such as showerhead manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, and coffee machine designers. In April of last year, Axiom Space launched the first private crew to the ISS. So privately recruited, privately trained astronauts working in the ISS National Lab. Axiom mission number 1 was a success, and it's planned to be followed by Axiom mission 2 this May. In February of 2020, NASA launched, or they awarded a contract to Axiom Space to develop and launch the first commercial module of ISS named HAB-1. This module is planned to be launched in 2025, followed by 7 more modules to form the Axiom orbital segment. So we have currently the Russian orbital segment, the US orbital segment, the Europeans, the Japanese also have their orbital segments, and now we'll have a commercial Axiom orbital segment. And when ISS reaches the end of its life, the Axiom orbital segment may just separate and continue on as the commercial Axiom space station, kind of piggybacking off of the success of the ISS and launching a new endeavor. And that end will come sooner or later, because what goes up must come down. As another bit of ISS history, the interim control module and the ISS propulsion module were two early modules originally designed to reboost the ISS to maintain orbit. So the ISS is in low Earth orbit. It encounters some measure of atmospheric drag. It slows down, it drops, and periodically we have to fire a booster to kind of push it back up into a stable, higher orbit. Before the Russians joined the program, NASA had its own designs for these modules to accomplish that, but both were scrapped in favor of using the space shuttle, which is no longer in operation, and the Russian Zarya module and the Russian Progress resupply spacecraft, which are currently the only viable options for reboosting. So we're kind of depending entirely on the Russians at the moment to keep ISS in its stable orbit. Northrop Grumman's Cygnus resupply vehicle has been gradually reconfigured with a gimbal-mounted engine for these reboost maneuvers. This was first tested in 2018, and the first full-power Cygnus reboost was performed in June of last year. Now, unfortunately, Cygnus is launched on the Antares rocket, which uses Russian RD-181 engines. So when the US hit Russia with sanctions following the invasion of Ukraine, Russia retaliated by halting delivery of engines. Northrop Grumman is currently working on a new version of Antares with Merlin engines produced by Firefly Aerospace, but for now, Cygnus is grounded. So yeah, we had an option and we lost it, and we're currently still relying on Russian reboost techniques. Maintaining orbit isn't the only reason we need working engines. Author Douglas Adams wrote, "Space is big. You won't believe how vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big it is. I mean, you may think it's a long way down the road to the chemists, but that's just peanuts to space." That's certainly true, but there's still plenty of stuff out there to hit if we're not careful. So during a routine inspection of Canadarm2 in May of 2021, the Canadian Space Agency operators noticed that debris had actually blown a hole straight through it. The arm was otherwise undamaged, and they deemed it a lucky strike because the arm is only 14 inches wide. So, what are the chances of this thing being tagged by space debris? But luck struck again. Let me get my pointer back here. Yeah, so luck struck again last December, on December 14th. When the docked MS-22 Soyuz capsule was hit by debris. While there was no abnormal loss of atmosphere, so it didn't actually punch a hole straight through the capsule, the impact did punch a millimeter-sized hole in its external radiator, and this raised some very serious questions about the capsule's viability for returning crew to Earth. This radiator, it's not used for actually cooling the crew compartment. It's used for cooling electronics, including the flight computer. So all of our electronic components have a minimum survival temperature, and if things get too cold, they tend to stop working. So the fear was that we would separate this capsule, we'd start returning the crew to Earth, and the flight computer would die, and that would be an incredibly, incredibly bad day. So it was actually announced this past Wednesday that the next MS-23 Soyuz launch was moved up. It was originally supposed to fly in, I think, March. Now it's flying in February to send an unmanned replacement capsule. While this damaged MS-22 capsule, I believe it's going to be used to in an attempt to return some samples. So if it works, great. If it doesn't work, the most we'll lose are some science experiments and other supplies coming back, but thankfully no people. ISS is not actually set up to have a spare lifeboat vehicle. Pretty much you're supposed to come down on the capsule you go up on. So if there's any problem like this on a capsule, we have to scramble a little bit to send something else up there as a replacement. Not that maneuvering is always helpful. So I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation in July of 2021, the latest and probably the last Russian addition the multi-purpose laboratory module, or MLM, or the Russians refer to as Nauka, or science, docked with the ISS. About 3 hours later, it began firing its maneuvering thrusters. Zvezda automatically fired its own thrusters in an attempt to automatically counteract this, but only managed to slow down the spin. This continued for about an hour until Nauka's thrusters completely ran out of propellant. The ISS rolled for about 1.5 rotations before returning to its original heading. The station wasn't actually damaged by this incident, but this certainly didn't do the aging space frame any favors. It's not really meant to do barrel rolls like this. So short of a random impact of greater severity, the limit of ISS will eventually come when its structure reaches the end of its life. The crews are already finding and patching small cracks in the older modules of the station, typically by drilling small holes at either end of the crack to stop its growth, and then sealing over it with epoxy and Kapton. So for the garage mechanics among us, they're literally holding it together with JB Weldon duct tape. Now, eventually, the ISS simply won't be spaceworthy anymore, and it'll have to be decommissioned. That's just the nature of things. Nothing lasts forever, and eventually everything has to end and come back down. So the current plan is to continue supporting ISS through 2030. It's actually kind of reached a milestone end of life multiple times now, and they keep extending it. I am pretty sure this is going to be the last one. So in 2031, the plan is to enter into a controlled deorbit and drop it into the Indian Ocean. There's been some, I guess, popular chatter on the internet about trying to save it and bring it back down. That's completely unfeasible. It's not meant to be torn apart. And now that we don't have the shuttle anymore or any other large scale reusable return vehicle, yeah, unfortunately there's no way to put the ISS into the Smithsonian or something in the future. So what comes next after ISS deorbits and this Axiom station wanders off on its own adventure? There are actually 2 more Russian modules currently in development, Science Power Modules 1 and 2. They were originally planned to launch in 2024, but in April of 2021, Roscosmos announced that Science Power Module 1 would be delayed until 2025. And now it's planned that this will be the core of a new Russian space station, the Russian Orbital Service Station, or ROS. So Science Power Module 1 is planned to combine with Nauka, which is that last Russian science module that launched the station, at the end of ISS when it kind of is disassembled and returns. And the redesigned Science Power Module 2 will launch in 2028 and form this new Russian station that you see here. The next international station, so it's an international station minus Russia as a partner, will be the Gateway Station, which has, again, gone through several different names. I think Gateway is the current internal nomenclature for it. The first 3 modules, the Power and Propulsion Element, or PPE, the Habitation and Logistics Outpost, or HALO, and this is a mouthful, the European System Providing Refueling Infrastructure and Telecommunications, or ESPRIT, are all planned to launch together in 2024 on a SpaceX Falcon Heavy, followed closely behind by International Habitation Module, or IHAB, on Artemis 4, which is the first launch of the SLS Block 1B heavy lift vehicle. And I guess my part in that program is I was working on as the safety engineer for the Universal Stage Adapter. So if you think of the Saturn V rocket as being like a beer bottle shaped rocket, at the neck of the bottle was something called the there was like an interstage adapter, an interstage fairing, and that's where they stashed the lunar module. SLS Block 1B has something very similar called the USA, or the Universal Stage Adapter, And that's where they're planning to stash this International Habitation Module and other large modules that'll launch on the that next big configuration of the SLS rocket. And continuing the commercialization of space, there are more commercial stations that may be joining Axiom Station in low Earth orbit. Sierra Space and Blue Origin are planning to have the orbital reef in operation by 2027. You'll see that many of these new designs are making use of these inflatable modules. This was first tested with the Bigelow Expendable Activity Volume on ISS in 2016. And work. Oh, I need a pointer back. So Sierra Space successfully proof tested their inflatable volume this past September down at NASA JSC in Houston, which burst at a pressure of 192 psi against the safety requirement of 182.4 psi. And this is pretty impressive. This is obviously not to scale, but when these things go, it's very impressive. So that we proof test everything. So the idea is for this not to happen on orbit, but to figure out where something actually fails, you actually have to make it fail down here on the ground. And that's one of the more exciting things about being a safety engineer. So Lockheed, it's been a local history. Lockheed recently tested their own version here in Waterton Canyon and got up to 285 psi for an even more spectacular result. And there's a YouTube video you can find online that goes through this in a little bit more detail. But yeah, when these things go, you notice. So Lockheed and another company named NanoRacks are racing Sierra Space and Blue Origin to have their own Starlab space station up. They're both racing for 2027. They're both aiming for the name of having the first operational commercial space station. And this up here is that habitable volume, like a larger version of that habitable volume that you just saw exploding. And then finally, Northrop Grumman is planning to launch their own commercial space station. It's literally called Commercial Space Station. They don't have a fancy name as of yet, ahead of retirement of ISS in 2030. So in the next decade, you may have to look forward to a much more crowded sky at night. And that is actually the end of the presentation. I've got a few slides of references that you can dig up later. But at this point, if anyone has any questions or any comments, I'm happy to try and field those.
Thank you, Alex. This was very informative. I'm sure most of us have learned something, even though we have been following ISS. I will ask you the first question. There are several other questions in the chat line, but I'll ask my first. I think I mentioned this to you before. What are the Chinese doing in the International Space Station arena?
So that's actually a really good question. The Chinese have had a series of their own space stations. So they're currently operating one that's a little bit smaller than the ISS in low Earth orbit right now. The Chinese were not included in the International Space Station. And the reason for that is for the ISS program, for that to work, it is a purely civilian, non-military venture. And although NASA and the Air Force and now NASA and the Space Force do work very closely on some initiatives, there are no military operations being conducted on the International Space Station. It's like part of the international treaty that underpins this entire endeavor. The problem is that, again, this is from my understanding, is that the Chinese Space Agency is actually part of their military. It's not a civilian venture. It's kind of under the same umbrella, similar to how the Russian space program prior to the fall of the Soviet Union and the beginning of the Russian civilian space agency was also kind of a joint civilian military endeavor. So besides the fact that, I shouldn't say the fact, besides the how am I going to put this politically correct? I'm not going to. The appearance that the certain entities may use exposure to international technologies and kind of lift that for their own purposes, or to reappropriate certain things. I think the core reason that's been put forward is that because the Chinese space agency is not separate from its military arm, it can't really fit into that international non-militarized treaty that underpins this program.
But what are they doing physically in this space?
Oh, like I said, they have their own station. I believe it's kind of in a similar orbit, but not anywhere close to ISS physically. But they have their own set of experiments that they're running. I actually don't have a whole lot of information on like the specific details of what they're running because I don't believe they publish it as openly as NASA. Pretty much everything that NASA does, anything that's done on the ISS is in public domain. I don't believe the Chinese space agency works under that same paradigm.
Okay. Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, let me ask the questions that were in the chat. Dina is asking, how long does NASA plan to operate the ISS? I think you might have answered it, but
so currently it's planned that support will end in 2030. It'll languish for a little bit empty, and then 2021 or 2031 it will be purposely deorbited so it doesn't just sit around up there where it can hit something else. Now that date has moved several times over the years, but given the aging space frame and all these other endeavors, I don't think NASA can maintain the Artemis program, Gateway, and ISS all together long term. I think the plan is to retire ISS, kind of move that funding into other endeavors and focus on Artemis and Gateway going forward.
Is it expected to burn in the entry mostly?
Mostly it's so big that it is going to, parts of it are actually going to survive re-entry, just like Skylab did in the 70s.
Right.
I'm sure many of you are familiar with that story where NASA had a plan to deorbit Skylab in a controlled fashion.
Yes, they couldn't.
It didn't exactly go to plan, and it actually came down on top of Australia, and Australia sent us a bill for the disposal fee. So the plan is to deorbit this over the Indian Ocean. There's for lack of a better word, a burial ground or a graveyard in the Indian Ocean where it's the largest mass of water without a human population. So it's the least likely for something to come down and hit a populated island.
Mark is asking, is there any work being done to figure out how to generate gravity, artificial gravity on the station?
Yeah, so I mentioned that Nautilus X module, which I think was the last serious approach to that. I don't know of
is there anything else?
Yeah, I don't know of a similar module being planned for Gateway. I don't believe so. Gateway is a much smaller station than ISS will be. I think the idea is that if you're going to send a manned mission to Mars or beyond, at some point you're going to have simulated gravity of some kind. One of the major goals of ISS was studying the long-term impacts of human life in microgravity. So we've had astronauts on station for over a year at a time, and yeah, they find significant health impacts to that. The human body, of course, evolved in Earth gravity. It's not designed to operate outside of that for long term. So if you want to maintain a healthy crew on a multi-year voyage somewhere else, yeah, they're going to have to figure out some way of having that gravity component, whether simulated or not.
Okay, next question, I think from John, because can you explain is it? Okay, hold on a second, I'm missing. Yeah, John is asking, can you explain the organizational structure that has to be a single person in charge of safety and operation?
Yeah, so that is a little complex too. So there are five international partners or IPs, and that's the US, Russia, Japan, Canada, and ESA. And ESA includes, I think, now 11 member countries have signed on to this, as well as some others that have tagged along. United Arab Emirates is planning on sending an astronaut to the station on the next US flight. So the five international partners all report to the ISS program. NASA has been named was originally named the manager of the ISS. They've now kind of delegated the US side of that to cases. And that's where things get a little complex because it's typically NASA has a very heavy hand in the ISS program level, but they're technically subservient to it. So certain problems go up certain chain of command, and there are mechanisms where NASA can actually be overruled on one of their own programs by this conglomerate. That being said, as far as like regular operations go, each of the segments operate their own areas of the station. So the Russians operate experiments in their section. The Europeans and the Japanese have their modules, and the Americans mostly operate in the Destiny module. And in those modules, each have their own chains of command for safety and operations. So when I was working on the ISS program for manned payloads in the habitable volumes, we went up through what's called the ISS Safety Review Panel, or the ISRP, which is based out of NASA JSC in Houston, but practically includes representatives from just about every NASA center or research station around the country.
Okay, the next question from John is, I understand the Russians are soon to abandon their participation. Is this correct, and when?
Yeah, so this is where I get to be a bit politically incorrect. So again, this is just my own thought and understanding, not anybody's official position. But Roscosmos threatens that somewhat frequently. Not so much lately. They actually replaced the head of Roscosmos, I believe last year, during the war in Ukraine. And I don't believe the new head of Roscosmos has been nearly as outspoken on some of these things. But yes, especially when all the sanctions were flying around at the beginning of the conflict, Roscosmos did threaten to pull out of the ISS program. They even threatened to disconnect their modules and go off and form their own station early. ISS is not actually designed to come apart like that. So while that was the threat was made, but you can't actually do that physically. And that obviously never came to pass. Eventually they mended fences. For the most part, what happens on the International Space Station, it should be above terrestrial politics, and largely it is, but sometimes it does kind of bleed into that relationship a little bit. So I believe at this point, there's no serious plans for Roscosmos to abandon their participation in the program ahead of breaking off Nauka and launching Ross in 6 or 7 years' time.
Bill,
But we'll see.
Bill Cass, do you have your hand up, or do you have a question?
Yes, I did. I'm not sure what it's called. I've seen many images, including one in the presentation with the Italian astronaut drinking coffee. But the observation module with all the windows in it. It's kind of a two-part question. Number one, when did that go into operation? And number two, it's aesthetically pleasing and a great thing. Does it have, other than that, does it have any scientific or mission-driven purpose?
Yeah, so you're talking about the copula, and I will show you that. We kind of blew right through that in where are we? Stowage, Harmony node 2. It's going to come up here very soon. Columbus. Kilo, where are you? Come on. Yeah, Lego would be proud. I actually have the Lego ISS at my desk.
Yeah, I was kind of looking for it when you went through this animation here, and I couldn't spot it.
Yeah, there. Oh, crap. Sorry. I hit the wrong button. Let's get back to. Come on. Now I've broken you.
Was it the black thing that came up underneath?
Yeah, I think I've actually just murdered my presentation. I have. Haha. 1 second. But yes, it does come up underneath.
Okay. Why don't you answer Bill's question without?
The thing is, I don't remember the date off the top of my head, so I will just.
Maybe not the date, but what is the purpose or
Oh,
what are
right,
the
the,
purposes of
so-
the module?
So to be honest, it's largely, again, my thought and understanding, it's largely a PR tool. It generates these very nice, very pretty images that everybody down here on Earth likes to see. And again, for NASA, any press is good press.
Well,
But
it's
in-
doing that job very well.
Yeah, it's actually the favorite module for the crew. So the crew does get a certain amount of downtime every day. And I think they actually compete for time in there. A lot of them just like to sit, watch, meditate, what have you. But I think it's also used not just for like general astrophotography, but there are some camera-based studies like studying cloud formation and other weather patterns through there. I think largely it is a PR tool.
Okay. Dina is asking whether it is true that the Russians have sole control over propulsion systems. What happens if they do withdraw, especially with propulsion systems?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, at the moment they do. Originally that was shared between the US and Russia, with the shuttle, I think, performing the bulk of those operations. And then once we retired the shuttle fleet, we have to lean entirely on the Russians. There's an old saying that two is one and one is none. So relying on a single partner for that ability is kind of an unstable situation, and especially, unfortunately, the way that ever so often someone threatens to withdraw from the program, that would not be a good situation. And that's why the U.S. was working very hard to retrofit the Cygnus vehicle with this capability. Unfortunately, nobody saw the possibility that we'd lose the launch vehicle for that vehicle, which kind of threw a monkey wrench into that plan. I believe SpaceX has talked about either adding that feature or having Dragon perform that function. That has not been tested on orbit. So it's one thing to say that you can do that. It's another thing entirely to have a proven method of supplying that.
Okay.
Dina is also asking whether you have ever spoken directly with the astronauts on the ISS.
No, so I'm not allowed to do that. So the way it works is the time I sat on console, I had a live feed, actually several live feeds for what was going on in the ISS that day. And there is a special crew office down at Johnson that has, actually it's not at Johnson, it's at Marshall Space Flight Center, that talks to the crew directly. Every once in a while, if it's a really complicated direction, they'll allow the science team to talk to the crew. But what we were having them do was not that complicated. So there's
I read the book that was written by astronaut Kelly. And he talked about lots of problems with toilets. Are they still having problem with toilets?
Yeah, I think I heard problems with the toilets even last month or the month before. So the plumbing has been a continual issue. You think pipes are pipes, but yeah, nothing works easily in microgravity. I don't think they're at the point of sending Howard from Big Bang Theory up there quite yet to fix it for him, but yeah, it's an ongoing
Actually,
issue.
something I learned from your presentation is that fire has different characteristics in space than on Earth. I didn't think that gravity had anything to do with fire, but I guess I was wrong.
Yeah, so when you think of a like a candle flame, obviously you have like a flame rising up from a wick, but in microgravity, when there's no up and no down, the traditional methods of like convection in microgravity don't really work anymore. So flames don't actually look anything like what you see down here. They're more like spherical pockets of like superheated gas.
Candles would look more interesting.
Candles would look much more interesting. Yeah, you get in a lot of trouble if you lit one, but
I bet. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience, from the members?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, in terms of the technical problems they're having with the plumbing, I mean, it would, we're always calling tech support for problems with our computers. I cannot imagine having to call tech support from the restroom. That would just be awful. And, but another thing about the cupula, I bought Chris Hadfield's book. The pictures that he took are amazing. So if that was an income, revenue stream generation thing, it worked.
One additional thing, Alex, as part of the Artemis program, they are planning to have something similar around the moon.
yeah, that's
I don't know when, what phase, whatever, but all those things that we learn with ISS, I'm sure will be very handy over there.
yeah. So that's actually the gateway station that I was talking about. So
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So the idea is that with the Apollo program, you were launching the Saturn V, which is this massive, super heavy lift vehicle, taking a crew to the moon, dropping off a lunar module, picking it back up and bringing it back to Earth, which is perhaps not the most efficient way to do things long term. So if you're talking about setting up a long term, if not a permanent presence on the moon, it's actually easier to set up, I guess, for lack of a better word, a bus station in lunar orbit. So you would ferry crew and supplies to the station, and then in the station, you would transfer over to a landing system, which would take you down to the lunar surface and back up. That way you're not carrying everything with you back and forth from the Earth every time that you launch.
What is the year for that?
That is actually coming up relatively soon. I think the last I heard, they were still planning on having Artemis 4 in 2026, I believe. There are some other delays in the program that I don't. Okay, so it was originally 2024. I think it's going to be 2026 now.
Okay.
So this is another like insider observation is that so SOS Block 1B uses a different mobile launch tower than Block 1. Block 1B is a larger configuration. So they had basically two launchers for the shuttle. Instead of having two identical launchers for Artemis, they have one for the Block 1, which we just saw launch last year, and another redesigned one for Block 1B. And I think that there were significant delays in the launch tower for Block 1B, which is going to set back the launch, like the first launch of that configuration, which is in turn going to set back the launch of that last component of Gateway. So when you have a problem early on in a program, it tends to snowball throughout the rest of your schedule, unfortunately.
Sure. When you were talking about how they would probably end the ISS so they could focus on other things, I was thinking about what they were saying about how when they plan to go ahead and do Psyche, although they're going to do it late, that means they're going to put a couple of other missions back a little ways, because managing them all together at the same time is difficult. So will you promise to keep your finger on the pulse and let us know when you can do a presentation about Gateway and other developments?
Oh yeah, I'll keep my ear to the ground. And
Good,
maybe I'll have some exciting things to share about what I'm working on now too.
good.
Good.
We'd love to have you back anytime you have something new for us.
Well, I appreciate that. I know it's not technically astronomy, maybe astronomy adjacent, but I'm always
Well,
happy
it
to talk
is,
space.
It is astronomy in the sense that this is how we explore the space.
Yes, definitely.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. We really appreciate you taking the time to put this together. And please do send me a copy of it. And if there are no other questions, we'll end the call and the live streaming here, Dina.
Okay, very good. Well,
Good.
let's
Thank
all
you very
show our
much.
appreciation before then. Thank you so much. And I will go ahead and end the